Hi folks, the title of this lecture is The Harlem Renaissance, Old Problems in the New Negro. The Harlem Renaissance was I want to say revival. It was, in parts it was a revival, but in parts it was a new focus, a new emphasis on Africana, on African American literature and poetry, paintings, artwork, you name it, but through the lens of an African experience. It was an attempt to connect the old world with the new. It was a celebration of Africana, as well as being an American. Well, the problem is exampled in the Scottsboro Affair. It's the early part of the Depression, and a bunch of poor people are riding the trains from town to town looking for work. We've talked a lot, and you've read a lot about segregation. Well, segregation happened at the higher level, at the middle level, but not the lower level. The poorest of people in towns and cities, blacks and whites live together. They work together. They live side by side. So segregation really did not happen with the poorest of Americans. And so on this train, we had several black teenagers. Here are their names: Haywood Patterson, Charles Weems, Clarence Norris, Andy Wright, Ozzie Powell, Olin Montgomery, Eugene Williams, Lee Robertson, and Roy Wright. Roy Wright was the youngest. I believe he was 13 at the time. There was several several white teenagers and men on this train, and there were two white women. Well, some sort of scuffle happened, and the white teenagers jumped off the train at the next stop, contacted a local cop, and told him that these black teenagers had gang raped two white women. That, in the South, would traditionally result in the black men being lynched. That was part of the slave mythology from beginning, that the black males, the slave males, want to rape white women, and so Southerners passed laws to protect the, quote, integrity of white women, basically by making rape by a black guy against a white woman a capital punishment, death penalty. We get here to 1930, 1931. The teenagers charge the black teenagers with gang rape, and there's a trial. There's actually several trials. Ruby Bates and Victoria Price are the two women who were supposedly gang raped. Both were prostitutes. Both were very poor. Both had lived in neighborhoods with other very poor black people. Both were well known to have African American boyfriends and lovers, and like I said, they were prostitutes, which did not come out at the original trial. I mean, look how nicely they're dressed. They're all going to find, all the Scottsboro boys will be found guilty of rape and sentenced to death, with the exception of the youngest, and there's going to be retrials and more trials. It's going to go before the Supreme Court. Eventually the Supreme Court is going to say you cannot have all white jury members. I mean, in every trial, every time these teenage African Americans were found guilty of rape, it was an all-white jury. The evidence that Ruby Bates and Victoria Price gave was sketchy at best. In fact, their stories didn't even jive. The details were not the same that these two women gave. Medical evidence was that one, and I think it was Victoria Price, definitely had semen on her, so she had sex, but the medical technology wasn't advanced to say, to get the genetic testing of who it came from, as well as the time period. Did it happen an hour ago? Did it happen 2 days ago? So anyhow, lots of trials. Some of them will be found guilty. Some of them will be released. One is sentenced to death. He escapes and spends like 35 years hiding. Well, the last trial, Ruby Bates, the woman in the middle there, in the light-colored outfit, she will eventually recant her testimony that these African-American teenagers did not gang rape them. They did not force sex upon them. As the white teenager said, with pistols and knives. None of that happened. So even though Ruby Bates, the accuser, the woman who said it didn't happen, the jury still found the black teenagers to be guilty of rape, even though Ruby Bates said the rape didn't happen. So, like I said, eventually it goes before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said you can't do that. So, this is the problem, is that the belief is that black men are lustful, they will rape white women, and there must be laws to segregate and to protect, like I said, the white woman's integrity. Well, what changes is the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance, once again, is this huge, sweeping, in parts initiation and some revival aspects of Africana. African-American culture as well as African culture. Here we see two African-American, a man and a woman. Look at those coats. Those appear to be mink coats. They are in they're in front of what appears to be a brand new automobile. These are certainly, I would have to guess, wealthy. Another aspect of the Harlem Renaissance is a segment of African American society becoming wealthy. You'll see in the back, those are 3 houses known as brownstones. Brownstones are a very popular housing unit in New York City. And today they're worth millions and millions and millions of dollars. Wealthy people live in those brownstones. The Cosby Show, right? Dr. Huxtable and his wife, the attorney, lived in a brownstone. When Harry Met Sally, they both lived in brownstones. Anyhow, brownstones today are owned by multimillionaires, and certainly the way that this couple is dressed in the automobile there and suggests that they're very wealthy. Wealth was certainly one of the aspects of Harlem Renaissance. One of the, I'm not sure if intellectual, maybe one of the political leaders, that's a better terminology, one of the political leaders of the Harlem Renaissance was this guy, Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey was not an American. He was from Jamaica, which plays an important part of our story here in a minute. Marcus Garvey came to the realization that black people and white people cannot live together. And so he was going to lead a migration of black people to Africa. And that he was going to create this country in Africa and name himself the president. Eventually, he's going to expand his ideas of creating a black society throughout all of Africa, and that he would be the president of all of Africa. Well, he comes to the United States and he talks about segregation, he talks about self-segregation, he talks about the problems that black people are having in this country with racism, he talks about the Scottsboro Affair. lynching and other problems, and it gets a lot of, and he focuses on Harlem, because Harlem is the at that time the black neighborhood of New York, and he gets a big following, and the men who join Marcus Garvey and Marcus Garvey's movement, they tend to wear uniforms which resemble military. They have marches, they have parades, and so hundreds of black men in what appears to be military uniforms marching through New York City will get the attention of the FBI. So the FBI starts following Marcus Garvey. They're tapping his phones, they're reading his mail, they're recording his speeches, they're analyzing his speeches as well as those around him. Here's Marcus Garvey in the outfit of an educated person. Someone who has at least a master's degree. I can't tell from the back. The distinction in the robes between a master's degree and a PhD is the hood. When you get your PhD, the ceremony is called being hooded. So if there's a hood on the back of this, he's wearing the garb of someone with a doctoral degree. The head covering suggests not. The head covering suggests this is someone with a bachelor's degree. The head covering of someone with a PhD is in the style of a 12th century Flemish academic. Anyhow, he tells these African-American followers in New York and throughout the rest of the United States that they're going to have to prepare for this big migration. And in order to do so, they have to make money. So he establishes these all black banks, banks that are owned and controlled, and the workers are all African Americans. And these banks will loan money to African American entrepreneurs who will start African American businesses, factories, industries, owned by African Americans. All the workers are African Americans. And they'll make something, they will produce something. And those things will be put on a ship, ships that are owned by Marcus Garvey, which he called the Black Star. England's famous merchant fleet was known as the White Star. So Marcus Garvey creates the Black Star, and he said that he's going to ship these products to Africa, sell them to the African people, and then bring the money back, and that'll help prepare them for the migration. He said the other thing we have to do is we have to train a certain segment of the African American population. They're going to be our leaders. So we have to train them how to be lawyers and doctors and politicians and teachers. And so there's this entire massive movement and transformation. Like I said, it is a back to Africa movement. We've seen this before. President James Monroe established this in the 1820s. Abraham Lincoln supported this in the 1830s. The first Back to Africa movement was known as the American Colonization Society. A bunch of white reformers collected money, and they bought a section of Africa, in which they named it Liberia. The capital was and is named after President Monrovia. And what the Colonization Society did was raise money, buy the freedom of slaves, and then send them to Africa. This was our first Back to Africa movement. During Reconstruction, there was a movement in Congress to collect all the ex-slaves, the 4.5 million Africans, or black people living in this country, what they called them the freedmen, round them up and ship them to an island in the Caribbean. Let's buy an island from the Spanish, and that island would be the black state in the United States. Once again, the idea of the Colonization Society, the idea during the Grant administration of creating a black state, the basic principle was that blacks and whites cannot live together. That's Marcus Garvey's position. So he's going to have this Back to Africa movement. There's another Back to Africa movement in the 1960s, and I'll hint about that shortly. Oops. Well, it turns out, one day, one of Marcus Garvey's ships hits a sand barge near the port of New York City, and the Coast Guard goes out to help them, and the Coast Guard finds out that what's in this ship, one of the black lines owned by Marcus Garvey, is not little trinkets and stuff being sold to Africans. It is alcohol. He is what they called a rum runner. He is buying Canadian whiskey, and he's taking it and selling it in the United States, which, of course, during Prohibition is a federal crime. He gets thrown in prison. One of his lieutenants, I'm trying to remember his name. I think it was John Little. Oh, man, I can't remember. Anyhow, this man named Little petitions the president to release him, saying, you know, he's a foreigner, so why should we spend federal tax money on him? So the government releases him and sends him back to Jamaica, where he launches another Back to Africa movement, this one focused on European Africans, or black people living in Europe. He'll eventually die, and he'll be buried in Jamaica. He's a huge, huge, huge national hero today in Jamaica. Anyhow, this lieutenant named Little, I think his first name was John. I can't remember. Anyhow, he had a son named Malcolm. Malcolm's going to grow up and spend a considerable amount of his youth in and out of prison. Malcolm is going to be introduced to a philosophy, a religion that supposedly was established by a guy named, what was his name? Elijah Muhammad in Detroit, and it's Black Islam or African Islam. There was a form of Islam established specifically for black people with the idea of going back to Africa. So this guy named Malcolm Little rises up and becomes a spokesman in his Back to Africa movement in the 1960s. Well, he'll come to the conclusion that his last name, Little, is actually a slave name. It's not his real name. It's not his African name. So he will take the place marker X until he can figure out what his real name is. So this is Malcolm X, who we will talk about when we get to the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement. Art was a major part of the Harlem Renaissance. A lot of wealthy white New York City patrons will find these exceptionally talented African-American artists and put on productions and demonstrations of their artwork. So a lot of the Harlem Renaissance African-American artists will become wildly famous throughout New York. Here's one by Aaron Douglas called Aspirations. Look at the bottom. It's dark. It gets lighter. It gets lighter towards the top. People on the bottom, clearly they're slaves. Here they are. They're reaching for the top. You don't see their face. They're just reaching. They're in chains.